When did we start wearing clothes? It sounds like a simple question, but the answer is not simple at all. There is no single date, there is no cave painting of the first person trying on a bear skin. The materials that early clothes were made from are long gone. Animal skins, plant fibers, leather, and fur all rot away. They don't fossilize like bones. So we are left with a puzzle. We have to look for clues, like detectives piecing together a story from scattered evidence. The story of clothing is the story of us. It is about a naked ape figuring out how to survive. It is about technology, migration, and even tiny insects. It is a story that begins with losing something essential, our fur. To understand why we needed clothes, we first have to understand why we became naked. Our distant primate ancestors were covered in hair. Look at a chimpanzee or a gorilla. They have a full coat. This fur is great for insulation, for protecting the skin from bumps and scrapes, and for deflecting some rain. For millions of years, this was the standard for our lineage, but then our environment changed, and we changed with it. Our ancestors moved out of the shady forests and onto the open savanna of Africa. They started walking on two legs. Bipedalism was a huge shift. It freed up our hands to carry things and make tools. But it also exposed our bodies to the direct, hot African sun. Walking and especially running long distances on the savanna generates a lot of internal heat. If you are a furry animal, you have a big problem. You can't get rid of that heat efficiently. You overheat. Most furry mammals pant to cool down, but a much better system, especially for endurance, is sweating. Humans became master sweaters. We have millions of sweat glands all over our bodies. When we get hot, we release water onto our skin. The water evaporates, and this process cools us down. It is like having a built-in air conditioner, but this system only works well if the sweat can evaporate easily. A thick coat of fur gets in the way. It traps the moisture and heat. So, over a very long period, natural selection favored less and less body hair. Individuals with thinner coats could run longer, hunt more successfully in the midday heat, and survive better. They passed on their less hairy genes. Eventually, we became the naked apes we are today. This probably happened somewhere around 1.5 to 2 million years ago. Being naked was a huge advantage in equatorial Africa. But it also created two new problems. First, our skin was now exposed to the sun's intense ultraviolet radiation. This led to the evolution of dark, melanin-rich skin, which acts as a natural sunblock. The second problem would not become apparent for a very long time. What happens when a naked ape leaves the warmth of Africa? What happens when you face a cold night, a chilling wind, or an ice age? You get cold. Dangerously cold. For a long time, this was not an issue. Early humans like Homo erectus stayed in the warmer parts of the world. But modern humans, Homo sapiens, were different. We were restless, we were explorers. Starting around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, we began to move. We pushed out of Africa in waves. We moved into the Middle East, into Asia, and into Europe. And Europe and Asia, we found a world that was much, much colder. We encountered seasons. We encountered ice ages where vast glaciers covered entire continents. A naked mammal has no business being in such a place. To survive there, you need a solution. You need a second artificial skin, you need clothing. So the need for clothes is tied directly to our migration out of Africa and into colder climates. This gives us a general time frame. We probably did not need clothes before we left Africa, but we definitely needed them to survive the winters of Ice Age Europe and Siberia. This narrows our search to sometime in the last couple 100,000 years. But how do we get more specific? Since the clothes themselves are gone, we have to look at the tools used to make them. Early humans were expert stone tool makers, but making clothes, especially from animal hides, requires a specific kind of toolkit. First, you have to get the skin off an animal. Early stone knives and blades were good for this. And then you have to prepare the hide. An animal skin straight off the carcass is stiff, fatty, and will rot quickly. You have to scrape it clean of all the fat and tissue. For this, you need scrapers. Archaeologists find stone scrapers by the thousands. These are often flint or chert tools with a flattened, sharpened edge, perfect for working hides. Some of these tools, when examined under a microscope, show a specific type of polish that comes from rubbing against leather. The existence of scrapers tells us that humans were processing hides. This was likely happening for a long time, perhaps for making simple shelters or bags. But it does not prove they were making clothes. You could just be scraping a hide to sleep on. To make actual fitted clothing, you need to do more than just scrape. You need to be able to cut the hides into shapes and fasten them together. The key invention for this is the needle. A simple, sharp point, an awl, can be used to punch holes in leather. You can then thread a strip of sinew or cordage through the holes to lace pieces together. Archaeologists have found bone awls that are tens of thousands of years old. This suggests early attempts at lacing things together, but the real game changer was the needle with an eye. A needle with a hole in it allows for true sewing. You can pass a thread through the material in a continuous stitch, creating strong, tight seams. This is the technology you need to make tailored clothing, shirts with sleeves, pants with legs, boots that fit your feet. The oldest known sewing needles are beautiful little objects carved from bone or mammoth ivory. They are delicate, polished, and have a tiny drilled eye at one end. The most famous and among the oldest come from a place called Denisova Cave in Siberia. A needle found there is estimated to be around 50,000 years old. Finding a 50,000-year-old needle is incredible. It is a smoking gun. It tells us, without a doubt, that people at that time had the technology to make sophisticated, sewn clothing. They were not just draping themselves in rough skins, they were tailoring, and it makes sense. To survive a Siberian winter, a simple cape is not enough. You need to cover your entire body. You need to trap a layer of warm air against your skin. You need well-made trousers, parkas, mittens, and boots. The invention of the eyed needle was as important for colonizing the cold north as the invention of the spaceship was for colonizing the moon. It was a critical piece of survival technology, so we can say with confidence that humans were wearing complex, tailored clothing at least 50,000 years ago. But what about before that? What about the time between losing our fur and inventing the needle? It seems unlikely that we went from being completely naked to sewing parkas overnight. There must have been a period where we used simpler clothing, simple wraps or capes made of animal skins that did not require sewing. How can we possibly find evidence for clothing that left no tools behind? This is where the story takes a strange and brilliant turn. The clue comes from lice. Yes, lice. Those tiny, annoying parasites that live on us. Humans are host to two main types of louse. There is the head louse, which lives in the hair on our heads and has been with our primate ancestors for millions of years. And then there is the body louse. The body louse is a fascinating creature. It is very closely related to the head louse. In fact, they look almost identical. But it has a completely different lifestyle. The body louse does not live in our hair. It lives in our clothing. It clings to the fibers of our shirts and pants. It lays its eggs in the seams. It only crawls onto our skin to feed and then retreats back into the safety of our clothes. The body louse cannot survive without clothing. It has evolved to inhabit that specific niche. This means that the body louse could only have evolved after humans started wearing clothes. If we can figure out when the body louse became a distinct species, we can get a date for when clothes became a permanent part of human life. This is where genetics comes in. Scientists can compare the DNA of the head louse and the body louse. They can count the number of genetic differences between them. DNA mutates at a roughly predictable rate over time. This is called a molecular clock. By measuring how much the DNA has diverged, scientists can estimate how long it has been since the two types of lice shared a common ancestor. In other words, they can pinpoint when the head louse first crawled out of our hair and found a new home in our clothing, eventually evolving into the body louse. Several studies have done this, and the dates they come up with are astonishing. The estimates vary, but they cluster around 170,000 years ago. Let that sink in. The lice tell us that we probably started wearing clothes consistently around 170,000 years ago. This is more than 100,000 years before the invention of the sewing needle. This is a powerful piece of evidence. It fits the story perfectly. It suggests that for over 100,000 years, humans were wearing simple, untailored clothing. We were likely draping ourselves in animal skins, perhaps held together with a simple knot or a thorn pin. We were doing this long before we figured out how to sew. We wore them often enough and consistently enough for a whole new species of louse to evolve and thrive in them. This date of 170,000 years ago also lines up with other things we know about human history. It coincides with a period of major ice ages, glaciers were expanding, and global climates were getting colder. It also coincides with the time when modern humans were starting to make serious pushes out of Africa into new territories. Clothing would have been essential for surviving these colder environments. The lice evidence provides a bridge, a missing link between being a naked African ape and a fully clothed Siberian hunter. There is other, more subtle evidence we can look for. What about art? What did our ancestors think they looked like? Early human art is rare, but starting around 40,000 years ago, we see an explosion of creativity in Europe. People were carving figurines and painting on cave walls, Many of the famous cave paintings, like those at Lascaux and Chauvet, mostly depict animals. The few human figures are often very simple stick figures, with no details of clothing. But there is another category of art, the so-called Venus figurines. These are small, handheld statues of female figures, often with exaggerated features. They have been found all across Europe, and some of them seem to show clothing. The Venus of Willendorf, a famous figurine from Austria dated to about 30,000 years ago, appears to be wearing a cap. The head is covered in a pattern that looks very much like a woven or braided hat. Another figure, the Venus of Lespugue from France, has a series of lines carved below her waist that strongly suggest a skirt made of twisted fibers or strings. Another figurine from Siberia appears to be carved wearing a full winter outfit, a hooded parka very similar to those worn by modern Arctic peoples. These are not photographs, they are artistic representations, but they show that the people making them were thinking about clothing. They were familiar with hats, skirts, and parkas. It tells us that clothing was not just a practical item. It was becoming part of their culture, part of their identity. Another source of powerful evidence comes from burials. How people treated their dead can tell us a lot about their lives. A spectacular example comes from a site called Sungir near Moscow in Russia. This site is about 34,000 years old. It contains the graves of several individuals, including 2 children who were buried head to head. The bodies themselves were gone, only the skeletons remained. But the skeletons were covered in thousands of beads made from mammoth ivory. And these beads were not just thrown into the grave, they were arranged in neat, orderly rows. There were rows of beads running down the arms, down the legs, and across the torsos. There were dense clusters of beads around the heads and feet. Archaeologists realized they were looking at the ghost of clothing. The beads had been sewn onto garments. The leather or fur of the clothes had rotted away completely, but the durable ivory beads fell in place, preserving the outline of what was once there. The patterns suggest that the people at Sungir were wearing tailored outfits. They had trousers, long-sleeved shirts or tunics, caps, and boots. This was not simple, primitive clothing. This was complex, decorated, and labor-intensive. It took an estimated thousands of hours to make these beaded garments. This tells us that by 34,000 years ago, clothing was not just for warmth, it was for display. It was a sign of status, of identity, of belonging to a group. It was fashion. So let's try to put the whole story together into a timeline. The story begins over 1.5 million years ago. Our ancestors in Africa lose their fur to stay cool. For a very long time, we are naked apes, living in a warm climate where this is an advantage. Then, around 170,000 years ago, things change. The lice evidence suggests this is when we started wearing clothes regularly. At this point, the clothes are probably very simple, uncured animal hides draped or wrapped around the body. They offer basic protection from cold and wind as humans start to explore colder regions or endure the fluctuations of ice ages. This is stage 1 of clothing, the simple wrap. Then comes a major technological leap. Around 50,000 years ago, as the needle evidence shows, we invent sophisticated tailoring. We learn to cut and shape hides. We learn to sew tight seams using bone needles and animal sinew. This allows us to create multi-piece fitted garments. This is stage 2 tailored clothing. This new technology is what enables modern humans to push into the harshest, coldest environments on the planet, like the Arctic Circle. It is what allowed them to cross the Bering Strait land bridge from Siberia into the Americas at the end of the last ice age. But the story does not end with animal hides. Humans also started to explore a new source of material plants. At a site in the Republic of Georgia, in a cave called Zudzwana, archaeologists found microscopic flax fibers. These fibers showed signs of being twisted and even dyed. They are 34,000 years old. This is the earliest evidence for humans making textiles. They were harvesting plants, processing the fibers to make thread or cord, and possibly weaving them into cloth or baskets. This is the beginning of stage 3 textiles. The ability to create fabric from scratch, rather than just using what you could get from an animal, was another profound revolution. It opened up a whole new world of possibilities for clothing. So when did humans first wear clothes? There is no single answer. It was a long, gradual process. We started with simple skins around 170,000 years ago out of the desperate need for warmth. We mastered complex sewn garments around 50,000 years ago, turning clothing into a high-tech tool for survival. We began experimenting with making textiles from plants over 30,000 years ago, setting the stage for all the fabrics we know today. Clothing did more than just keep us warm. It changed us. It allowed us to live almost anywhere on the planet. No other mammal is so widespread. We live in deserts and rainforests, on mountains, and on the Arctic ice. We could not have done that without our portable artificial fur. Clothing also changed our society. Here, it created a new boundary between our bodies and the world. It introduced concepts of modesty and privacy that are central to most human cultures. And, as the Sangir burials show, it quickly became a way to communicate without words. Your clothes could show who you were, what group you belonged to, and how important you were. Clothing became a canvas for art and a symbol of status. It is a strange thing to think about. The act of getting dressed every morning is one of the most routine things we do. We put on a shirt, pants, socks. We rarely think about it. But this simple act connects us to a deep and ancient story of survival, ingenuity, and migration. It connects us to a time when a well-scraped hide or a sharp bone needle was the difference between life and death. It is the story of how a naked, tropical ape figured out how to conquer the world. The clothes we wear today are the direct descendants of those first animal skins, wrapped around a shivering ancestor on a cold night, long, long ago.